The United States Navy was deployed against a group of anti-fascist freedom fighters, not to rescue hostages, not to stop a massacre, to protect a dictatorship. That is not a theory. That is what the sealed diplomatic record confirms, and for decades, the world was told a different story entirely. In January 1961, a Portuguese ocean liner called the Santa Maria was seized on the open Atlantic by 70 armed dissidents who had been planning this moment for years. They were not pirates. They were not terrorists. They were men who had watched their country suffocate under 40 years of authoritarian rule and decided that a passenger ship in international waters might be the spark that burned the whole rotten system down. They were wrong about that, but not for the reasons history would later suggest. What stopped them was not justice. It was a phone call between governments that had already decided whose side they were on. This is what actually happened aboard the Santa Maria, and what happened behind closed doors while it did. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar had ruled Portugal since 1932, nearly 3 decades. He had built what he called the Estado Novo, the new state, a regime held together by secret police, censorship, colonial violence, and the quiet starvation of political opposition. His secret police force, the PIDE, monitored letters, tapped phones, imprisoned dissidents without trial, and made people disappear in ways that never made the official records. Portugal was a founding member of NATO, a Western ally. And that alliance, more than any principle, is what ultimately determined how the hijacking of the Santa Maria would end. The man who planned the seizure was Henrique Galvão. He was 62 years old in January 1961. He had once been a loyal servant of the Salazar regime, a colonial administrator and inspector, a man who had traveled Africa on behalf of the Estado Novo and filed reports the regime wished he hadn't. In 1947, Galvão submitted a report to the Portuguese National Assembly documenting the systematic abuse and forced labor of Africans in Portugal's colonies. He described conditions he called worse than slavery. The regime's response was not reform. It was to bury the report, strip Galvão of his position, and eventually imprison him. He spent years inside a Lisbon prison. He escaped in 1959. He made his way to South America, and he did not stop planning. By late 1960, Galvão had aligned himself with a broader anti-Salazar resistance movement, the Iberian Revolutionary Liberation Directorate, known by its Portuguese acronym DRIL, which also sought the overthrow of Francisco Franco's Spain. The plan they settled on was audacious and, in its logic, almost elegant. Seize a Portuguese flag vessel in international waters, declare it liberated territory, sail it to Angola, then a Portuguese colony in open revolt, and use the ship and the international attention it generated to ignite a wider uprising. They had no air support, no navy, no government backing them. What they had was the belief that the world, watching a ship taken in the name of freedom, would demand that Salazar fall. On January 22, 1961, 70 members of DRL boarded the Santa Maria at various Caribbean ports as ordinary passengers. The ship had departed from La Guaira in Venezuela and was carrying roughly 600 passengers and a crew of more than 300. In the early hours of January 23rd, in darkness and open water south of the Caribbean, Galvão's men moved through the ship and seized control. There was violence. A Portuguese officer named Lieutenant Maia was killed resisting the takeover. Several crew members were wounded. Galvão would later insist Maia had fired first. The Portuguese government would insist he had been executed. That dispute was never cleanly resolved. What is not disputed is that by dawn on January 23rd, the Santa Maria, a vessel flying the flag of Antonio Salazar's Portugal, was under the command of his enemies. Galvão got on the radio. He announced to the world that the ship was now a free Portuguese territory. He called himself the commander of an operation of war. He asked the international press to pay attention. The world did pay attention. Headlines ran across Europe and the Americas. Photographs circulated of passengers on the decks, apparently calm, some apparently curious, a few apparently terrified. Galvão maintained that passengers were not his targets. He was almost fastidious about this, distributing food, holding a funeral with full ceremony for the officer who had died, corresponding with journalists. He wanted the optics of liberation, not massacre. But inside the embassies and naval command rooms, a very different conversation was already underway. The United States military response was immediate. Within 24 hours of the seizure, American naval vessels were tracking the Santa Maria across the Atlantic. British warships joined the pursuit. This was framed publicly as a search and rescue operation. The passengers were in danger. The ship needed to be found. These were the words that reached the newspapers. The internal communications told a different story. Portuguese diplomatic cables and American State Department records, many of them declassified only in subsequent decades, show that Salazar's government was in direct contact with Washington within hours of the hijacking. The Portuguese foreign minister made clear what Lisbon needed: not a negotiated resolution, not the safe return of passengers as a first priority. What Salazar needed was for the ship to be intercepted before it reached Angola. Because if the Santa Maria arrived at Luanda, if Galvão landed with a captured Portuguese vessel and declared it liberated ground in the middle of a colonial war, the propaganda damage to the regime could be catastrophic. The Kennedy administration had taken office just 2 days earlier. January 20th, 1961 was Kennedy's inauguration. He inherited this crisis on day 3. And despite Kennedy's stated discomfort with European colonialism, despite the fact that his incoming administration had signaled a more skeptical view of Portugal's brutal hold on Angola, the strategic calculus overrode the principles. Portugal was a NATO ally. The Azores were a critical American air base. That base, Lajes Field, gave the United States refueling and staging capability across the entire Atlantic. Losing access to the Azores was, in the cold logic of 1961 Cold War geography, not acceptable. And so the United States Navy found itself in the Atlantic not to liberate passengers from armed men, but to ensure that those armed men did not succeed in liberating their country. The pursuit lasted 11 days. The Santa Maria moved erratically, changing course, Galvão buying time, hoping for something: a port that would take them, a government that would recognize them, a spark in Angola that never came. The American and British ships shadowed them the entire time. At one point, American aircraft flew directly over the Santa Maria. The message was not subtle. Galvão continued to communicate with the press. He gave interviews by radio. He described the regime he was fighting, the prisons he had escaped, the report about colonial slavery that had cost him his freedom. He was articulate, and he was not wrong about the facts of Salazar's Portugal. But articulate men on stolen ships in 1961 with no air cover and no port willing to receive them did not start revolutions. They ran out of fuel, food, and time. On February 2, 1961, after negotiations brokered largely by Brazilian diplomats, Galvão agreed to bring the Santa Maria into the port of Recife in Brazil. Brazilian President Jânio Quadros had offered political asylum to Galvão and his men, a significant act of defiance toward Lisbon and Washington that would contribute to Quadros's own political isolation and eventual resignation later that year. The passengers disembarked. No one had been killed after the first night. Galvão held a press conference on Brazilian soil. He was calm and deliberate. He said the operation had succeeded in its primary goal, which was to show the world that there was a resistance inside Portugal and that resistance was willing to act. He was not entirely wrong. The Santa Maria affair generated enormous international attention to Salazar's regime, to the Portuguese colonial war in Angola, which had formally erupted with a major uprising just days after Galvão landed, and to the question of whether a NATO member could be allowed to run a brutal colonial empire without consequence. But consequence was slow in coming. Salazar remained in power until 1968, when a stroke finally removed him from government. His successor, Marcelo Caetano, was himself overthrown in 1974 by a military coup staged largely by officers who had grown exhausted and disillusioned fighting colonial wars in Africa. That coup, the Carnation Revolution, finally ended the Estado Novo and gave Portugal a democracy. Henrique Galvão never saw Portugal free. He died in exile in Sao Paulo in 1970, 4 years before the revolution came. The diplomatic cables that documented America's decision to prioritize Salazar's political survival over any principle of democratic resistance were not open to researchers for decades. The official story, repeated in newspapers in February 1961, was that the navies had been deployed to protect the passengers. The passengers, it turned out, were never the point. A ship was hijacked to start a revolution. The most powerful democracy in the world sent its navy to make sure the revolution failed. And they were right to worry, because 13 years later, without a single American warship, the revolution happened anyway.